Welcome to Video Game Genres, where your host Gexup provides you information you need to know about a certain number of video games put in a category. And tonight's episode of Video Game Genre is Fighting Games. Now, when it comes to action games, it is expected to have numbers of enemies and bosses to keep us occupied in fighting each of them. Without enemies or anything trying to kill or challenge you, then it shouldn't be considered an action game, now will it? Despite what kind of action game there is, there should be enough variety of enemies to defeat in order to keep the player occupied with the game. However, there are a lot of action games that should feel ashamed of themselves for not making enemies challenging enough. My problem with many action adventure games is that facing each of them is quite repetitive because they're all just duplicates, all thinking the same, they're too easy to kill, always throw repeated attacks, hardly change their strategy in trying to defeat you, and they die too quickly. Action games that seem to have a lot of traveling seems to have more focus on adventuring than the difficulty of taking your enemies out that hardly even matches your skill level. Heck, even boss fights feel underwhelming when they always reveal their weak spot to the player. It's kinda sad to see almost every fight seems to be the same, and they're not really as cool as watching the Kung Fu action films. Oh, wait a minute. Now, if you want a video game genre that takes time and skill in taking your enemies down and gives you energy and intensity when doing so, then fighting games should be your type of game. Before the public had any access to the internet, fighting games was the #1 social gaming phenomenon because it was the only video game genre back in the day that involved more than one player to compete in a fight. This action genre started its phenomenon when Street Fighter II was released in the arcades, and still to this day, people around the world are still competing against each other in fighting games. Thanks to Street Fighter II, this game opened new doors for other fighting game series to expand its new competitive fighting style gameplay. However, Street Fighter II was not the first fighting game, nor was it the original Street Fighter. Heck, even the first fighting game wasn't really the first one-on-one competition that started this formula of fighting games. Well, in taking a good close look at it, fighting games wasn't the only game that had players to compete against each other. In fact, sports games were the pioneers of one-on-one competition in video games. Like all sports games, the sports games back in the late 70s, when video games were new, were trying to mimic what everybody knows about each sport and simulate them in a video game using what limited technology they have. Since sports games have athletes and teams challenging against each other one-on-one, this made useful for the two-player multiplayer that we all take for granted today. But what specifically started this one-on-one fighting gameplay, you may ask? Well, simple. Boxing games. The very first boxing game that was ever recorded in history was a game called Heavyweight Champ, released in 1976. According to Wikipedia, this was Sega's earliest game, which had black and white graphics with a control style with a plastic boxing glove attached to the arcade cabinet. Because being the first fighting game, it was also notable for its imaginative control system. This competitive fighting formula started to grow over the years. Having new boxing games over the years have improved over Heavyweight Champ and started to have better graphics, controls, players focused on strategies and skills, and better ways of knocking your opponent out before the time limit ends, like boxing for the Atari 2600. Then in 1979, a developer named Tim Scaly has started a new one-on-one fight in the arcades called Warrior. This was a breath of fresh air from having boxing games being the only competitive gameplay. Rather than fighting each other with fists, players can carry a sword and use them against each other by having a player to actually have a tip of a sword to hit the player first. Players can also use a sword to push away his or her opponent's sword and find an opening. This was a new style of playing offensively and defensively, which is a strategy of fans of fighting games uses today. The only flaw with Warrior is that it only has one-hit kills and there aren't any rounds like in boxing games. So the evolution of fighting games doesn't stop there. In the early 80s, as boxing games continued to evolve, there was one boxing game that fixed the flaw of having scores and at times one-hit kills to declare a winner. Sega took what they started from Heavyweight Champ and made its successor available for the arcades and the SG-1000 called Champion Boxing, which was Yu Suzuki's first game. What Champion Boxing innovated was to have players to have their own health bar. This feature itself tells players how much longer can one player last until the end of each round. When either one of the bars is all the way down, then the player loses a fight and declared as a knockout. Since the health bar was made, every fighting game today uses a health bar. Then a year later, a company called Technos Japan Corporation has released a game called Karate Champ for the arcades. The player plays as a karate competitor and fights other players or computers that stand in his way to become the karate champ. Using 2 joysticks, the player can execute numbers of moves. This finally made one-on-one competition gameplay that finally involved more than just punching. Finally, in Karate Champ, you can use karate chops, high kicks, low kicks, roundhouse kicks, high jump kicks, and more, offering variety of movesets for the player. Now this is where playing offensively and defensively is played at its full potential. Otherwise, you'll just get hit and automatically lose. Not only did Karate Champ offer new one-on-one fights, but the game also included bonus mini-games after each fight that test the player's skills and made sure that fighting isn't all that's offered. What's new on the table is that players have new backgrounds and stages as the player continues the game. This was a breath of fresh air for players because all the boxing games from the past were always in the same ring, which tired many players in seeing the same thing every time they play. Not only did it offer new stages, but also a lively crowd reacting to whoever is the winner of each round, and had a voice of the referee or the Kung Fu Master when the fight starts, whoever's the winner of each round, and what round that the fight is at. To say that Karate Champ is innovative is an understatement. What Technos has started in Karate Champ was way ahead of its time. It was Karate Champ that made what fighting games are today, and earned its reputation as the first fighting game ever created. But yet, it was heavily flawed for having one-hit kills for each round. Since the release of Karate Champ, there were imitators trying to beat the competition with games such as Way of the Exploding Fist, International Karate, and more. Then in 1985, a company called Konami realized that many fighting games were a bit too realistic and decided to make a game that was unlike anything else before it, and that game was Air Kung Fu. What this game brought to the table is to have better controls, button combinations, a health bar for each player to fight, much more unique characters to face off, and weapons. This is the very game that inspired future games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat because it put a lot of imagination for the fighting game genre. Air Kung Fu is the fighting game that broke the boundaries of realistic fights that was started from Kung Fu Champ into that wild and exciting fighting gameplay. Air Kung Fu was inspired by fantasy Kung Fu films from China and Japan. Now you can jump high in the air, make combos, nice selection of button combinations, and new variety of weapons from each character. The only problem is that you can't play any other character besides the hero, Oolong, which is really underwhelming considering that the enemies you face are much more exciting. Capcom wasn't ignoring its competitor and decided to join the competition with fighting games. Then in 1987, Capcom entered the scene with fighting games with the release of Street Fighter. This game took everything that was in Air Kung Fu and brought even more variety. You play as Ryu on his quest on finding the best fighters in the world, but like Air Kung Fu, you're unable to play any of those characters. The only different character selection is only when player 2 decides to join battle, and his only exclusive character is Ken. What Street Fighter offered new was more button combinations, more ways of making combos, and the ability to throw projectiles. Part of the game's appeal was to use special moves that can only be discovered by experimenting with the game controls, which created a sense of mystique and invited players to practice the game. Street Fighter also introduced other staples to the genre, including blocking techniques, as well as the ability for the challenger to jump in and initiate a match against a player at any time. The game also introduced pressure-sensitive controls that determine the strength of an attack. Though due causing damage to the arcade cabinets, Capcom replaced it soon after a 6-button control scheme offered light, medium, and hard punches/kicks, which became another staple to the genre. The only problem with Street Fighter is that there was too much difficulty going on with the game. Now the new focus on fighting games is on the developer's attention: balance. Balance is important for fighting games because we wouldn't want to have an overpowering character to manage to dominate every other character, have cheap movesets that cannot be beaten, or have something over another character. Without balance, then a skilled player will have bigger chances of losing against an amateur player who knows little about the game and have all the advantages not against him just because he has a more overpowering character. So since balance has become more of a big focus for fighting games, we would have to wait for our next game. And you know what that is? In the year 1991, a fighting game that has seen a light of day that will forever change the face of the gaming industry. That game is Capcom's masterpiece, Street Fighter II: The World Warrior. Street Fighter II is one of those sequels that literally improved on everything over the original. It offered much more balanced gameplay, players to finally have the ability to select a character, having the ability to select the stage, better number of characters to fight, and characters you can finally select to play as besides Ryu. This is the very game that started the fighting game boom in the 90s, expanding the fighting game genre into a whole new level, having numbers of people around the world playing against each other, making up to $1.5 billion in revenue. Street Fighter II was so successful that Capcom kept milking out the game by making new edition of Street Fighter II more balanced than ever before and new variety of characters. Since Street Fighter II changed the gaming industry, thus more video game companies entered the fighting game scene, with companies like SNK had released Fatal Fury, Samurai Showdown, and Art of Fighting for the arcades and Neo Geo. Sega released Dark Edge and Eternal Champions, and by 1992, a company called Midway had released a game that changed the gaming industry more so than Street Fighter II did. That game was... So how did Mortal Kombat change the gaming industry more than Street Fighter II? Well, it featured digital characters drawn from actual actors, numerous of secrets, its own fighting system like jabs and uppercuts, and let's not forget about the highlight of the whole series, the fatality system. Finishing maneuvers with which the player's character kills their opponent in the most brutal way possible. Mortal Kombat brought violence to a whole new level, so much so that it caught politics' attention on violence in video games and was so controversial to the public that it forced the United States government to create an ESRB rating system, or Entertainment Software Rating Board, to warn parents and gamers what content each and every game has included. Since the impact of Mortal Kombat, fighting games has become more and more violent, as well put much more imagination by the developers. Since then, we had countless Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter clones, but as well there has been a lot of new fighting game mechanics that set its own standards as its own identity. Another game that has changed fighting games is a game that took a giant leap in the rise of 3D graphics in video games. That game is Sega's Virtua Fighter, released in 1993. It's easy to forget how groundbreaking it was to see Virtua Fighter now, because in this day in gaming, we're always seeing better graphics and fighting mechanics than the first Virtua Fighter, but this game set the standards of fighting games to finally be in 3D. The camera position is in the 2D plane, but environments are in 3D, meaning that both players can see their characters like in a 2D fighting game, but they rotate in different directions when they do sidestepping or when someone gets hit and rotates around, and the camera zooms in and out depending on how far the opponents are from each other. But regardless of how unbalanced it may be to have opponents far away from each other, they are limited to be anywhere they want to, because there are consequences of losing when to get out of the arena, aka ring outs. This is the very game that created the 3D fighting game subgenre and led the genre into the more realistic route, despite Virtua Fighter being the fighting game series that still only remains 3 buttons. By 1995, the dominating franchises were Mortal Kombat series in America, Virtua Fighter series in Japan, and the Street Fighter series all around the world. Throughout this period, the fighting game genre was the dominant genre in competitive video gaming. So that wraps up the history of what you need to know about fighting games. So now then, let's talk about fighting games as a whole. Here's what you need to know about fighting games. They are the immediate and definitive pick up and play video games. They are fast paced, they're competitive, and they're always great to spend time with your friends. No matter what game you play, the premise is simple. A collection of crazy fighters from all around the world with wildly clashing style of martial arts that get together and pound the living fudge out of each other until in the end, there can only be one. It focuses more on your enemy than any other video game genre out there, because each selected fighter has his or own separate moves, and it's not easy to defeat them like in other video game genres that has enemy encounters. This genre is also distinct from beat 'em up games, another action genre involving combat where the player has to fight many weaker enemies at the same time. Fighting games has often aimed to martial arts, which suits well for the theme of fighting games. Players of fighting games are most likely to prefer fighting games that has an excellent moveset for each character and how well controlled they are. Fighting games on the 2-dimensional plane of motion gives player not only to move left and right, but also crouch and jump up and down, while recent games tend to render in 3 dimensions, also allow sidestepping, but otherwise play like those rendered 2 dimensions. Your goal in fighting games is simple. Keep beating your enemy until your opponent's health bar is out, and keep your own health bar from reaching 0. You do this by hitting successful attacks, and each successful attack depletes opponent's health, and the game continues until either one of the fighters' energy reaches 0 or run out of time and declares the winner by who has the most health in their health bar. Fighters will repeat the process, consisting on several rounds, until either one of the fighters wins the total of number of rounds required, because there can only be one. As a round is over, both fighters get back up their feet in the same position position as they started, with both their energy restored, ready for another round. Except for games like Killer Instinct, where the opponent can regenerate their health after they lose their first pair of lives, while the other who's still standing must continue to fight with no health regeneration. Both players only have one health regeneration, and once either one of them lost their last regeneration, that player loses the fights. Fighting offensively is what the game expects you to do, but as well, that's what the opponent is doing at the same time. So fighting defensively gives you more advantage from losing too quickly, which is blocking and moving away from your opponents. Some fighters can block by pressing the back button when the opponent is hitting you, or press and hold another button to apply the block. But don't rely on it too much, because getting hit while blocking does damage your health, but not by much. And sometimes when blocking too much, it can also break your block. Thus, strategy becomes more important to the player to predict the player's move, similar to rock, paper, scissors. Players of fighting games love variety of movesets. One great example of a good fighting game is to have various movesets such as light, medium, and heavy attacks. It's a reason why Street Fighter II has a 6-button layout to have different attacks, which made Sega to finally release a 6-button controller for their port of Street Fighter II to be just as good as the same port on the Super Nintendo, because the SNES controller already had 4 buttons and 2 trigger buttons. This also made players to apply combos, in which several attacks are chained together using basic punches and kicks. Another common feature in fighting games, and it has been fundamental to the genre. Some fighting games display a combo meter that displays the player's progress through a combo. The effectiveness of such moves are often related to the difficulty of execution and the degree of risk. These moves are often beyond the ability of a casual gamer and require a player to have strong memory and excellent timing, which also requires a lot of practice and learning from the game. Some games also allow a combo meter, which allows players to use special attacks that employ complex combinations of buttons presses to perform particular move that's beyond basic punching and kicking. But having the same character to have the same move and special attacks will indeed make the game incredibly bland, and games like Street Fighter II realizes that players want to have different characters with different stats, movesets, and appearances. In Street Fighter II, they've given fighters from all kinds of nationality in order to make them as different as possible. Since then, we got a lot of fighting games that has a selection of characters that are Native Americans, Bruce Lee knockoffs, insane freaks, Jamaicans, Kung Fu masters, blondie Americans, fat white boys, black boxers, and the most popular and most overused stereotypes in the whole genre that grabbed a lot of attention: attractive women. Game designers realizes that a lot of male players really like to select Chun-Li, so other developers that were in the fighting game business offered a lot of female characters in their games. And since then, they've gotten sluttier, more exposed, and appeared very sexual. And considering that most of these games are made from Japan, you wouldn't believe how imaginative Japanese can be. Even Capcom, that kept releasing remakes of Street Fighter II, had released a new character, Cammy, and exposing her legs and showing her bare— "Dude, what the hell are you watching?" "Nothing. I'm just doing an episode of Video Game Genres." "Whoa, look at the buttons of Cammy." "What? Dude, get out of here. I've got a job to do. Do your own nogging in your own spare time." "Oh, come on, dude. I want to see." Now where was I? Oh yeah. Call it sexist or stereotyping, but these developers did a great job at making characters from being identical. And sometimes when the players want to select the same fighter, they've made them different by changing their costume color, or else both players will be confused on who's who. Another thing that keeps each and every fight feel non-repetitive is stage selection, in order for each location for every fight to look different. But regardless of how the stage looks, there's a lot of limitation for defensive players to end up in the corner, and allows offensive players to beat the hell out of them as a consequence for them not playing offensively, and for 3D fighting games, they'll lose in ring outs. Since there has been a wide selection of character stereotypes that works well in fighting games, this also means that any other character from any other series or franchise can join in the genre, regardless if they're balanced or not. In fact, doing crossovers is an ingenious idea for fighting games, and one of the first games of the genre that did so was King of Fighters 94, where SNK brought characters from Fatal Fury and Art of Fighting together, and since then we had Marvel vs. Capcom, Super Smash Bros., and many more. Since there are some gamers that have more than one favorite character in a fighting game, there has been fighting games that has tag teams where you can go beyond 1-on-1, go up to 2-on-2, 3-on-3, or heck, a 4-player free-for-all. But with tag team, there has been plenty of fighting games that has numbers of special attacks, sneak attacks, and double combos. I also want to mention that fighting games is another video game genre that has subgenres, so if you watch the older episodes of Video Game Genres, you should already know that it's time to name the subgenres of fighting games. The one that you should all already know is the traditional 2D fighting games. This is perhaps the longest lived fighting game in this subgenre that still continues to this day, mainly because it's the most basic and yet the most traditional fighting game style. Yet, I've already discussed about 2D fighting games for more than half of this episode, so let's move on. The second fighting subgenre is 3D fighting games. Thanks to Virtual Fighter, it made fighting games in a more realistic route to be more fun. As I said, it's similar to 2D fighting games because it's in the 2D plane, but the environments where the character is at are indeed 3D. Fighters can rotate in different directions as they do sidestepping or when someone gets hit to change their position of the arena, and the camera zooms in and out depending on how far each opponent are from each other. And instead of having corners like 2D fighting games, some of them have walls to make sure that fighters remain in the arena, or if there's no walls at all, then there are chances that the fighter can end up losing by ring outs. But don't get confused with actual 3D fighting games to 2.5D fighting games, because 2.5 dimensions, despite being in 3D graphics, is in fact a 2D fighter, and you can't rotate like an actual 3D. The third fighting game subgenre is another subgenre that doesn't have a name, so I have to make it up. Free roaming fighting games. This is where you have much more freedom than the traditional 3D fighting games, because it doesn't go on a 2D plane, but rather it's 100% 3D, and the camera decides which player to focus on. And if the mode has multiplayer, and players are separated from each other, the screen may divide into split screen, so that way all players can see where they are. You have much more room and places to end up, able to carry weapons, and use power-ups to use for your advantage, and or have destructible environments. But usually it's unbalanced considering that players can lose their focus on their enemies, and also escaping has no consequences. This fighting game subgenre is not as popular as the traditional fighting games, so here are my recommendations for free roaming fighting games. Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee, War of the Monsters, Tom and Jerry, War of the Whiskers, Power Stone 1 and 2, and especially the Dragon Ball Budokai series. The fourth fighting game subgenre is platforming fighting games. This is where fighting and 2D platformers combine into one. You fight in a 2D plane, but the ground isn't the only place that fighters will stay. You have platforms and various places to end up, and this fighting game subgenre made stage selection matter because of how big or how small some stages are, how the platforms differ for your advantage, and how often the stages alter their surroundings as time passes on. And without moving away, players will easily have the environment hurt or kill you. Depending on what settings you made, your goal is to knock your opponents off screen by causing more damage to them, and the more damage they get, the easier they will fly off the screen, or take out their HP if the settings is about taking out their HP. Never was there a fighting game that made players jump so much just to get somewhere. You also have advantages such as weapons and power-ups to help you against opponents. This is perhaps the most fun because there's so much going on at once, and yet having 4 players to compete against each other couldn't be more enjoyable. The only problem is, the Super Smash Bros. Series is the only recognizable out of this subgenre, and anyone who tries to follow it is accused of being a Super Smash Bros. Clone. So here are my recommendations for this subgenre. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Smash Up, Digimon Rumble Arena, and Small Arms for the Xbox Live Arcade. The fifth fighting game subgenre is boxing games. It's debatable whether it should be categorized as a fighting game or a sports game, but either way, there is no denying that boxing games are the roots of this genre. It also has a various number of rounds, combos to make, and it does apply strategy when playing offensively and defensively that fighting games follow today. But knocking your opponent out does take time in making numbers of successful punches. But if either one of the boxers can't make a knockout in time before the match is over, then the judges decide who is the better fighter based upon how either one of the fighters displayed a good fight. But not only boxing games play this type of gaming, but also mixed martial arts games that takes even more leaps and bounds than just punching, but as well kicking, grappling, ground attacks, and submissions. And the final fighting game subgenre is wrestling games. This is where you have much more freedom than boxing and MMA games, because you have grappling, running, striking attacks, submissions, finishing maneuvers, flying moves, and often have weapons to use. There should be no reason why wrestling games can't have more than one mode, because the best ones offers tag team, weapon variety, different rules and goals, interferences, and the ability to get in and out of the ring. And sometimes you could go backstage and in the streets to fight each other. You may not have any blocking, but you do have reversals to counter your opponent's moves. Your goal is to pin your opponent to 3 counts, make your opponent submit in a submission hold, make him lose for a 10 count fall, fall or KO your opponent to win. But to do so, you must cause as much damage on your opponent as humanly possible. This is a fighting game subgenre that has much more freedom than free-roaming fighting games, but does a fantastic job of making them chaotic. So that's all I can say about the good things about fighting games. However, like all video game genres, this one as well has some problems. First off, if you're one of those gamers that judges games by its story, then this is a game not aimed for you because again, fighting games are built to compete and has no room for adventure, just fighting. Sure, they give out backstories for each character and cutscenes at the end of single player mode, but is it what you call Grim Fandango, Metal Gear Solid, or Shenmue's level storytelling? But what really led the downfall for fighting games in the 90s was that there were numbers of developers trying to beat the competition by cloning most of the popular ones out of it. If you could just remember back then, there were countless of Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat clones, and once in a while we've seen revolutionary games like Killer Instinct, Smash Brothers, and Soul Calibur. But the main problem about fighting games is that multiple developers attribute the decline of the fighting game genre to its increasing complexity and specialization. This complexity shut out casual gamers, and the market for fighting games became smaller and more specialized. It takes time to practice and master such fighting game, and what's the fun for some gamers to have practice and so much training? Heck, there was never a fighting game that didn't have a cheap boss at the end, and it even takes more practice to beat it. Not to mention that there are plenty of experienced players that knows the game too much that competing against them will have all the odds against you, and what fun is it to be beaten all the time because the player has more memorization than you? Another big problem about fighting games is that it's memorization over skills that ultimately made newcomers find it unappealing to memorize such ridiculous combo layouts. Memorization and skills are two separate things, and it sucks that no matter how well your strategy is with fighting games, some asshole has too much advantage knowing cheap movesets that he memorized while you have to watch your character brutalized for a giant unfair advantage. And remember the talk about balance in fighting games? Well, there is without argument that there are plenty of fighting games that are completely unbalanced. Just take a look at this moveset. In order for anyone to enjoy it, you have to memorize this combination by spending countless of practices, and there is no possibility for a regular player to apply a special or a fatality move because there is too much memorization to do so. Not to mention that fighting games in the arcades, you can't practice because there is only two modes, versus mode and single player mode. Speaking of arcades, fighting games was the biggest highlight for people to come to the arcades, and as time moved on, consoles got more and more powerful that they were capable enough to have their own port from the arcades. And to have console ports of certain games to make it to home console made less people to come to the arcades and rather play at home. I mean, would you rather waste your quarters on every game you play, or get the whole game to yourself that has so many modes in it and to play whenever you want at home? Heck, even games like Soul Calibur were so much better to be played at home than in the arcades. Furthermore, arcades gradually became less profitable throughout the 90s due to its increased technical power and popularity of home consoles. It looked as if fighting games were going to be perfect for home consoles, right? Well, consoles that were perfect for fighting games didn't sell too well and discontinued, such as the Neo Geo, Sega Saturn, and Sega Dreamcast. For other consoles that were still strong and had some fighting games, it couldn't last any longer because due to the fact that there's another video game genre that's overshadowing all the others, especially competitive gameplay. You know what that is? That's right, first-person shooters. It seems that people want to shoot off each other and cheat by camping rather than showing off skills and fighting like a man. The problem about fighting games in the Xbox, PlayStation 2, and GameCube era is that it did not have an online feature. If you don't have anyone to play fighting games with you, then you can't possibly enjoy playing fighting games because again, fighting games are built to compete against players. And sometimes fighting against CPU is not enough, and thus playing against other players is much more exciting. If you don't have anyone to play, then you probably would sound like this guy.
Personally, I find fighting games boring as all hell. I could play them for a day and then I get bored as shit. It doesn't matter what fighting game it is. I will get bored of it.
FPS dominated the competitive gaming world so badly that other fighting games such as Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution and Soul Calibur 3 didn't sell well compared to the golden days of fighting games. But thankfully, fighting games are far from over because developers realizes what they need in their games in this day and age, and fighting games continues to evolve by adding online play so console players at home can fight against as many players as they want. Games like Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Virtua Fighter 5, and Soul Calibur 4 finally featured online play to fight against as many players as they want. And Capcom finally released Street Fighter 4, and just recently, as of this video, the long-awaited Marvel vs. Capcom 3 has seen the light of day, and Mortal Kombat 9 has caused as much controversy for its violence as it did when the series started, and as well offered finally a great story in fighting games. To me personally, I'm happy that fighting games are still around because my brother and I still play as many as we could get a hold of, and after all these years, it's still my #1 choice for competitive gameplay, for inviting friends over and having a blast to play against each other. And by the way, if you come and visit Japan, I strongly recommend anyone to try the arcades because arcades in the US and anywhere else in the world is almost non-existent. But arcades in Japan are still popular and running strong. Whether if it's consoles, arcades, or anything else, fighting games is perhaps one of the most exciting social gaming video game genre of all time.